In 1951, Father Couturier, a Dominican friar who worked with stained glass, recorded a conversation with the great painter Henri Matisse, who told him that for him, les deux plus grands portraitistes sont Rembrandt et La Tour, pour la vérité. Les autres, c'est toujours un peu du théâtre. Perhaps that's a rather theatrical way to start this talk, but the idea that Maurice-Quentin de La Tour stands with Rembrandt above all others for truth in portraiture will seem to many of you an extravagant claim. You might expect Rembrandt to be bracketed with Holbein, Rubens, or Van Dyck. Even among French portraitists, Rigaud or David might be higher up your list. But I'd like to explore why someone as eminent as Matisse might say this to a priest. There are, of course, plenty of reasons for the current neglect that have little to do with Latour's genius. Portraiture today is unfashionable, and especially so in Latour's case, given the elitism of his sitters, kings, powerful and wealthy men, a handful of women, and just one black. And as for pastel, the median is anathema in academic art history. Ordinarily, the best way to rehabilitate an artist would be with an exhibition. However, the pandemic has had a devastating impact on museums and galleries worldwide, and in particular on temporary exhibitions. In any case, pastels are too fragile to travel, so some may regard removing the temptation to move them as a silver lining. So we're thrown back onto what we can do from home. Some of you may have seen my previous YouTube video explaining the mechanisms of my online dictionary of pastelists, and in particular the embedded catalogue raisonné of Latour's work. I'm going to assume you can all find your way among these resources, including the work lists, the in-depth essays on some of the pastels I'm going to mention today, and the chronological table of documents. You'll find Matisse's comment, with a great many more opinions on Latour, in the fascicle called Critical Fortune. I'm not going to attempt to give you a complete biography of the artist, who, you will know, was born in 1704 in the last years of Louis XIV's reign, and died in 1788 in the last years of his great-great-great-grandsons. Latour was born and died in Saint-Quentin, a rather dull industrial town in the northeast of France, where another famous artist was educated, Henri Matisse. In Latour's day, it was the centre of the linen trade. By Matisse's time, it was better known for sugar beet production. Latour escaped as soon as he could and spent effectively all his career in Paris, a half-century more or less coinciding with the reign of Louis XV. He made one brief trip to Holland for a few months. He never went to Italy, as all history painters wanted to do, and he only returned to Saint-Quentin when he was so demented that he fell for his brother's ruse, the promise of a trip in a hot air balloon. Spending the last few years of his life in Saint-Quentin, certified insane, but squabbling furiously with the local authorities over plans for the charities that he founded. Invariably presented as a great local philanthropist, the mayor and municipal councillors at the time viewed his apparent altruism with some caution. They saw it as an attempt to buy control. Rather a familiar theme in philanthropy today. And when you read the vast literature that has grown up around Latour, you'll encounter story after story about him, more or less obviously apocryphal, certainly exaggerated out of all proportion. Latour has been let down by his biographers, all of them greedily latching onto these legends. They come from a eulogy given after his death by a priest who didn't know him, wasn't even the first choice to give the oration, and who derived his knowledge by talking to the locals in Saint-Quentin. They, in turn, knew only the stories that Latour himself had told during those last 4 years of his life. Thus, his dementia is solidified into hagiography. Just to take a simple example, Mariette tells us that Latour's intellectual pretensions and how he studied Pierre Belle's dictionary before he would go to intellectual gatherings of Enlightenment salons where he presented half-digested ideas. Duplaquet calls him le peintre philosophe, avide de tout savoir, and adds that he studied mathematics and geometry during the 2 years that he devoted to mastering drawing. While the later biographer Bissely d'Estrées tells us that he had vaste connaissances en littérature, il était bon mathématicien et bon géomètre. Louis XIV used to quip that his geographers had deprived him of more territory than he had won in all his wars. I sometimes have that feeling with regard to the stories about La Tour and his biography. Well, we do know a good deal more about the family. For example, it turns out that La Tour's mother, of whom virtually nothing was previously known, came from Noyon, from a family of tapissiers and tailleurs. You might wonder whether that is of any interest at all, but I think the connection with weaving and the cloth trade generally helps explain the minute observation of fabrics which is central to his art. Look, for example, at the carpets in two of his most famous works, the Président de Rieux in the Gaîté and Madame de Pompadour in the Louvre. In case these are unfamiliar, let me show them to you side by side. In terms of sheer technical bravura, it is difficult to envisage anything to match these enormous pastels. The Président de Rieux, exhibited in the Salon 1741, stunned the critics with its achievement. This was, after all, just a pastel, but the miracle planted La Tour's firmly centre stage, where he was to remain for 30 years, with a stream of commissions from the royal family, the old nobility, the noblesse de robe, and the nouveaux riches financiers, the most powerful, the wealthiest, the most famous, and the best informed sitters of Ancien Régime France. I am, of course, jumping ahead, except that this Shandian talk isn't an attempt to supplant the linear narrative in my online material, which is a far better way to learn about La Tour, with nice pictures you can view properly and at your leisure. All I'm hoping to do here is to point out a few surprises you'll encounter if you do go through my catalogue. Returning to the family, of La Tour's 8 siblings, only 4 survived adulthood, none married. 2 of his brothers also broke away from this family background. You might assume this was through the artist's influence at court, but I don't think that is so. His elder brother, Charles, had obtained a position as Directeur des Vivres en Italie by 1736, before the artist had any such power. Charles was sent to Corsica for several years in 1738 in a senior capacity, and made enough money for him to be able to invest jointly with Maurice a huge amount, some 80,000 livres, in a property development which went wrong and led to protracted litigation. You can find an account of this hitherto overlooked incident in my documentation. La Tour also had a younger half-brother, Jean-François, who was much better known than Charles, since the collection at Saint-Quentin was his bequest. His career in the elite regiment of gendarmes bourguignons was hitherto rather obscure, but we now know that he fought at Fontenoy as early as 1745 and became an officer and Chevalier de Saint-Louis 21 years later. He retired in 1778, returning to Saint-Quentin, where 6 years later he would take charge of his brother. Since none of the siblings married, there were no direct descendants, but a group of La Tour's pictures and papers passed through relations of his stepmother, the du Liège, to a certain Flore Joséphine Varluzel, whose connection I only unravelled a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, although the papers were bought by the historian and La Tour biographer Charles Desmazes and presented to Saint-Quentin, they perished in the First World War, although miraculously the main collection of La Tour's studio survived, being seized and exhibited by the Germans in an episode that continues to divide opinion. To return to the pastelist. It's perhaps surprising that it was not until 2002 that his contract of apprenticeship was located in the Archives Nationales by François Marchandet. This showed that just after his 15th birthday, he was apprenticed for 6 years to a minor painter called Claude Dupuche, shown here, not, as previously thought, to an equally obscure painter called Jean-Jacques Spoud. Perhaps Mariette misheard information given orally. Confusingly, while Spoud occasionally used pastel, Dupuche does not appear to have done so. However, unusually for so obscure a painter, Dupuche was noble. He was also well connected in the art world to the families of artists such as Oudry, Rigaud, and the Lemoine sculptors. Mariette tells us about La Tour's encounter with the elderly premier peintre Louis de Boulogne, who recognised his raw talent. The story is repeated by La Tour's friend Marie-Felle in a later letter in which she cryptically refers to son arrivée à Paris, sa vie dissipée, probably a reference to one of the best-known stories about La Tour, namely that he broke his apprenticeship, returned to Saint-Quentin, and got his cousin pregnant. The incident did indeed occur when he was just 18, with his cousin Anne Bougier, an illiterate knitter of stockings. The infant didn't survive, but Anne was tried for concealing her pregnancy, an offence treated as infanticide under the rigorous laws of the day. She received only a modest fine, possibly because she admitted only to a small difference in age, although she was in fact nearly 5 years older than La Tour. Her own mother had been just 12 when she married. What I think is clear is that the episode scarred La Tour deeply, and relief for women in childbirth was prominent among the charitable causes that he promoted towards the end of his life. As is said of almost every pastoralist of this era, La Tour was supposed to have devoted himself to pastoral following Rosalba Carriera's visit to Paris in 1720. There is nothing to suggest they met, but at some stage he made two not very accomplished copies after her best-known pastorals. Here's one that shows that he hadn't quite got it when compared with the original in the Louvre. The second one may have been copied around 1732 when it belonged to the family of Louis de Boulogne. Of rather greater importance, I think, is La Tour's exposure to the work of French pastoralists at this time. La Tour would surely have known the great Vivien pastorals belonging to the Académie, among them this pastoral Robert de Cotte on the left, and may well have had access to the numerous Vivien pastorals of French artists. Even if the influence is undocumented, visually La Tour's approach to portraiture, as we can see in his pastoral of Ory on the right, is far closer to Vivien than to Rosalba. But the big breakthrough in La Tour's career came with his portrait of Voltaire. That Voltaire should commission his portrait from a virtually unknown artist may have been less preordination than the rather banal coincidence that La Tour, based in the Hôtel Jabach, was a close neighbour of the Abbé Mousineau, Voltaire's agent in Paris. The sittings took place in April 1735. The portrait, which is lost, the two préparations, the numerous copies, and dozens of different engravings transformed La Tour's reputation. A minute point was picked up in the course of a very thorough investigation by Hervé Capizès, who looked after the Musée Antoine Lécuyer at Saint-Quentin, and, I should take this opportunity to note, has been extremely helpful to me in sharing La Tour documentation, particularly as it relates to the collection there. In a letter from Voltaire to his agent about repetitions, he refers to la copiste. Sadly, no name has come down to us, but the article alone tells us that she was female. That Voltaire probably knew who she was, or he would have assumed that the copiste was male, as we would, and that La Tour already had an active business requiring the employment of copyists. I want to pursue two strands of this. The question of copies is one I'll return to, but first I want to tackle one of the most important themes in La Tour's oeuvre, the self-portrait. I'm prompted because I think there's an undeniable similarity between his Préparation of Voltaire and one of his own self-portraits. Indeed, it is arguable that La Tour had a habit of capturing genetic traits and projecting them onto more than one sitter. We'll come back, too, to the question of accuracy of representation. But the self-portraits range over the period from 1737 to perhaps 1770, and occupy a central place in his oeuvre. Perhaps surprisingly, they never show him working with pastel crayons. Nothing better illustrates the difficulties of establishing a chronology for La Tour's work than this series. To take the one on the right alone, one recent author has argued for 1737, another for circa 1740, while most sources accept Xavier Salmon's verdict that it belongs to the period of 1755 to 60. The point is that there is no consensus, even when we know the age of the sitter, which is one of the reasons why, for practical utility, my catalogue is not arranged chronologically. Even if I were able to get the sequence right, it would be harder for you to find anything. Latour's were not the first self-portraits in art, or even in pastel, any more than Rousseau's Confessions were the first autobiography in literature. But the degree of self-obsession in both surely reflected the mood of the time, the ultimate expression of the ens representans, in Arthur Danto's phrase, the man who defines himself through making representations. But the obsessive search for an accuracy he never found satisfactory calls to mind another Latin phrase. Like Ovid's Narcissus, et placet et video, sed quod videoque placetque non tamen invenio. I am charmed, and I see, but what I see and what charms me, I cannot find. Before finally realizing, iste ego sum. It's me, is of course the message of all serial self-portraitists. While we're here, it's time to broach one of the trickiest areas in cataloguing Latour, the question of repetitions. Voltaire's was not the only portrait that was duplicated, and the degree of Latour's involvement often highly debatable. This is particularly the case with the collection of Saint-Quentin, where pupils were set pieces to copy at the drawing school he founded. Most of these later copies are easily discoverable because the nature of pastiche is to include sentiments and expressions that are anachronistic, and it is the task of the connoisseur to detect these lapses in taste. Sometimes the giveaway is so blindingly obvious, as in this chimera in Saint-Quentin, sticking Maurice de Saxe's head onto the Marquis de Voyer's body, that no one had spotted it until I embarrassingly did so recently. Often more conventional copies can be confirmed, or sometimes detected, by elements of the physical construction which depart from the traditional assembly of the 18th century pastel. You can find a lot of information on this in my prolegomena, so that you can expect with a French pastel of this period that the paper will have been pasted onto canvas or marouflé sur toile, already mounted on a rigid frame called a strainer. When you find a keyed stretcher instead, or a canvas stamped with a 19th century supplier's mark, or no canvas at all but a modern board, your suspicions are confirmed. But the problem with Latour is that he often departs from convention in all sorts of ways. For example, quite a number of the pastels turn out not to be marouflés sur toile at all, but to have been executed on paper pasted to cardboard, some of them even hacked irregularly to fit into new frames. If we'd found a single example, we'd have been tempted to call fake. But there are so many, even in Saint-Quentin, that we have to accept that this was within his practice. Even more astonishing is his bonkers idea of protecting pastels by encapsulating them between two sheets of glass. Most of these have been discarded by later conservators, assuming they couldn't possibly be original. But by finding several examples, as well as the account given of the technique, I was able to show that these were in fact original. So, construction alone won't decide the issue in many cases. Let's now look at one of the most famous self-portraits, the so-called Autoportrait au Jabot at Amiens, the version on the right, with a more modest version, the Musée Cognac-G on the left. It is the Amiens version which has been universally reproduced, not merely as the primary version of the portrait, but as the quintessence of Latour, used as frontispiece for innumerable Latour publications. It is even chosen in two of the most important works on pastel, Ratouille de Limé's 1946 book and the 1927 exhibition catalogue. Indeed, Ratouille de Limé called it magistral, avec une virtuosité que le pasteliste rarement dépassé. I suspect most people assume that since Latour was an honorary academician at Amiens, and the work was there, it must have come from him. Wildenstein gives only a garbled account of its provenance, but when I examined this closely, I discovered that the Amiens picture had belonged to the Abbé Mongenod, who had in fact disclosed in the Mercure that what had been given to him was not the original Latour that had been sent to the Salon, but a copy by one of his pupils, Jean-Gabriel Montjoie. See the footnote underlined in blue. Sometimes it's not the eye of the connoisseur, although I'd had some concerns about this one before. I'd kept them to myself in the face of universal acceptance, nor any kind of scientific investigation, but diligent archival work on dull documents that provides the real security in art history. Too many practitioners disdain this, or haven't the stomach for it, and favour the development of abstract theory, which for me is a far less reliable approach to understanding art. Perhaps I should mention, too, the role of overlooked documents in another case, despite the even greater fame and greater scholarly attention. The famous portrait of Madame de Pompadour, which we saw at the beginning. Until I read them carefully about 4 years ago, La Tour scholars had largely ignored the numerous references to La Tour in the correspondence of Madame de Graffigny with her friend de Vaux. For example, in writing of the Salon 1742, she picked out La Tour pastels as masterpieces, surtout le sien, peint avec un chapeau à point d'Espagne, de troussé d'un côté, qui lui fait une ombre sur le visage. C'est un morceau parfait, je ne pouvais m'en arracher. The anonymous critic in the Mercure picked out this portrait inimitable de l'auteur, dont le goût de Rembrandt. 6 years later, Madame de Graffigny was horrified when she asked him about this piece. It had been intended for the Uffizi, he told her, but he had foolishly shown it to Louis XV, whose enthusiasm was not what La Tour had hoped for. So he tore it to pieces. It's notable that this is the portrait that Diderot later mentions as having been shown in the famous confrontation between La Tour's self-portrait and Perronneau's. Subsequent authors have all assumed it was the Amiens autoportrait au jabot that was confronted in 1750. At that same encounter in 1748, Graffigny asked to see La Tour's large pastel of Madame de Pompadour, which had already become famous, earlier than most researchers had known. La Tour told her that he had destroyed it. Il l'a encore brûlé parce qu'il avait donné un faux trait. I doubt if La Tour should be taken literally. When he told Mariette that he had burnt his portrait after attempting unsuccessfully to fix it, Mariette didn't completely believe him. But the pastel now in the Louvre was not exhibited in 1755. It shows the addition of a new head on a separate sheet, bizarrely covering a hole in the original canvas. And as I've argued at some length in my essay on the work, Madame de Graffigny's testimony offers an alternative and more plausible explanation to the state of that picture than any previously advanced. La Tour's willingness thus to destroy his work, even if it had reached an advanced stage, out of a sense of perfectionism, was legendary at the time. Here are 2 more famous examples in the Louvre. As I pointed out in my review of the Louvre catalogue, the 1793 inventory noted that, in view of the damage inflicted by the artist, on peut compter que les glaces. 3 years later, the next inventory recorded the 2 as sans bordure, and presumably sans glace as well. No doubt they were further destroyed and damaged. Astonishingly, in the 19th century, the Marquis de Chenevière contemplated having a modern pastelist repaint them. So in many ways, La Tour was the precursor of the tortured artist of the 19th century. This quest for perfection may arguably have led to mental illness, when, whether and in what form, will themselves require a lecture. Duplaquet noted straightforwardly that cette sévérité met un prix infini à ses portraits. It's possible to read this with modern art world cynicism as an early example of an artist manipulating the market value of his work. La Tour certainly did have a keen sense of the importance of the great artists in society, which would shock no one today. But while we got Voltaire and Amiens self-portraits in our head, I want to touch on La Tour's expressions, something which is in many ways the main theme of this talk, as hinted at in my subtitle. Those of you of a certain age will recognise my having borrowed the phrase "the smile of reason" from an episode in Kenneth Clark's classics television series Civilization, where it was the title of episode 10 on the Enlightenment. In the book, there is only a passing reference to La Tour in connection with Salonière. We know exactly what they looked like, because French artists like Perronneau and Maurice-Quentin de La Tour portrayed them without flattery, but with a penetrating eye for their subtlety of mind. Only in a highly civilized society could ladies have preferred this kind of likeness to the glossy fakes of fashionable portraiture. In the film, although La Tour's name doesn't pass his lips, and makes only a minute appearance, his pastels do appear in a short clip, which I think you should see for yourselves.
Here is the wittiest and most intelligent of them all, in fact, at a certain level, one of the most intelligent men that have ever lived, Voltaire. He's smiling, the smile of reason. You know, there's a character called Fontenelle, a French philosopher who, by living to be nearly 100, bridged the 17th and 18th centuries, the world of Newton and the world of Voltaire. He held a position known as perpetual secretary of the Academy of Science. He told an interviewer that he had never run and never lost his temper. The interviewer asked him if he had ever laughed. He said, "No, I have never made ha-ha." But he smiled. And so do all the other distinguished writers, philosophers, dramatists, and hostesses of the French 18th century. It seems to us shallow. We've got into deep water in the last 50 years. We feel that people ought to be more passionate, more convinced, or, as the current jargon has it, more committed. The smile of reason may seem to betray a certain incomprehension of the deeper human emotions, but it didn't preclude some strongly held beliefs. Belief in natural law, belief in justice, belief in toleration. Not bad. The philosophers of the Enlightenment pushed European civilization some steps up the hill. And in theory, at any rate, this gain was consolidated throughout the 19th century. Up to the 1930s, people were supposed not to burn witches and other members of minority groups, or extract confessions by torture, or pervert the course of justice, or go to prison for speaking the truth, except, of course, during wars. This we owe to the movement known as the Enlightenment, and above all, to Voltaire.
Note the appearance of the Amiens self-portrait. La Tour's portrait of Fontenelle is known only from a rather wretched print, so Clark was right to show us the Rico instead. But in the slightly arch story about the philosopher, I'm surprised Clark didn't tell us that the interviewer was Madame Geoffrin. I'm less surprised that he didn't tell us that his title, now my subtitle, was borrowed from Jean-Raoul Carré's 1932 monograph on La philosophie de Fontenelle, ou Le secret de la raison. But I think we can shed a little more light on La Tour's faces and how he set out to convey that subtlety of mind than Clark wrote about. One simple feature is the use of accessories. Instead of the pets or porte-crayons favoured by his rivals, it is the book that seems to take on special significance in La Tour's work. It is often of music, sometimes handsomely bound, Maurice, for example, with his arms prominently displayed as a bibliophile, in the process of actually being read, uniquely by the Abbé Hubert, or being immediately reflected upon, as in Mademoiselle Ferrand the Savant, or furtively consulted. The nun might be expected to be reading a work of devotion, rather than what turns out, on close inspection, to be a musical score. It can be big, as in Du Monde Romain, or small, with Voltaire, open, as in Lady Guive, or with just a finger holding a place, as in the other we saw in the last slide. Madame Royer and the Abbé Hubert have additional books in piles. Madame de Pompadour has them in neat upright rows and flat on the table. The Président de Rieux has paper bookmarks to show that his volumes are in use. Mademoiselle Sallé's are still in the bookcase, practically invisible, but nothing in a La Tour portrait is unseen. Except, nearly, the folio in veau fauve, edge on, hidden behind the bust of Louis XV, leaning on the mirror, and so unseen twice, in the Dauphine and her son, Saint-Quentin. Many of the volumes are dog's-eared. This visually gives the illusion of reality, while symbolically denoting the directness of the sitter's engagement. These are working materials, not unopened presentation volumes for show alone. While Mademoiselle Ferrand's copy of Newton has been adapted by La Tour from the real edition, as he similarly enlarges some of Madame de Pompadour's volumes to give them a greater visual presence, his depiction of the score in Marie Fell's copy of her brother's Seventh Cantate is accurate. The implication is clear enough. La Tour is the painter of the intellect, of minds that are at home among the volumes that epitomize their interests. Even when not explicitly bibliocentric, an even rarer quality of La Tour's portraits is their ability to capture, or at least convey, the sitter's intelligence. It is notable that Lavater chose a La Tour pastel of Paradis de Moncrief, wretchedly engraved, to illustrate this, adding this commentary, which may be loosely translated as, "No one would easily relegate this face to the class of idiots. Nobody will fail to recognize the fine man of the world, the man of taste, whether in the whole picture, or in the eye, especially in the nose, also in the mouth." So how does this fit with Clarke's smile of reason? In a way, this sits oddly with the focus on intelligence. In other artists' hands, the two can be contradictory. From Champfleury to Matisse, La Tour's smiles have defied analysis. Are they this essence of portraiture, or are they artificial betrayals? Ernst Gombrich contrasted his approach with Roger de Bille's advice to painters, which emphasized that when the sitter puts on a smiling air, the eyes close. La Tour defied this, leaving his eyes open. And yet the very combination of slightly contradictory features, of a serious gaze with the shadow of a smile, results in a subtle instability, an expression hovering between the pensive and the mocking that both intrigues and fascinates. True, the game is not without its risk, and this perhaps explains the degree to which the effect froze into a formula in the 18th century portraits of polite society. La Tour is also the master of showing, often with the tiniest glimpse, teeth, a phenomenon in 18th century portraiture that has received some attention recently. There are numerous smiles with visible teeth in earlier portraiture, from Boucher to Perronneau and Madame Roseline, but as Colin Jones notes, La Tour made numerous subtly animated portraits in which the teeth floated tantalizingly in and out of focus. He brackets the dental exposure of his Democritian self-portrait with those by oddball artists such as Liotard and Ducre. In fact, a much more subtle example is this portrait of Duval de l'Épinois, where La Tour employs a trick whose magic is only revealed de visu. It does not really work from a photograph, however high the resolution. As the pastel is approached, the expression suddenly changes at a distance of about 1 metre, from a wry, quizzical, almost cynical ambiguity to one of pure pleasure. This is effected by the inclusion of the sitter's 2 top front teeth in the slightly opened mouth. They are virtually, but not completely, invisible in the pastel, but are frankly not perceptible at a distance or in reproduction. The trick was used by other artists, notably by Vigée Lebrun, one of whose hallmarks it became, but never with quite so much subtlety. Among other examples are Mesdames d'Angeville, Leconte, the so-called Inconnu No. 2, Roussel, and of course Manelli, where arguably La Tour went too far. One of the critics couldn't help but laugh with the Italian singer appearing in Paris in Pergolesi's Maître de Musique, while Gautier d'Agouty positively disapproved of hanging the picture beside portraits of serious philosophers. Of course, Kenneth Clarke explains the problem. Manelli had escaped the smile of reason and had started to make ha-ha. Perhaps that's a good note to end on.